Legislative Council New South Wales is a state on the east coast of Australia. It borders Queensland to the north, Victoria to the south, and South Australia to the west. Its coast borders the Coral and Tasman Seas to the east. The Australian Capital Territory is an enclave within the state. New South Wales's state capital is Sydney, which is also Australia's most populous city. In June 2020, the population of New South Wales was over 8.1 million, making it Australia's most populous state. Just under two-thirds of the state's population, 5.3 million, live in the Greater Sydney area. The demonym for inhabitants of New South Wales is New South Welshmen. Some have protested this term, but there is no commonly accepted alternative. The colony of New South Wales was founded as a British penal colony in 1788. It originally comprised more than half of the Australian mainland, with its western boundary set at 129th meridian east in 1825. The colony then also included the island territories of New Zealand, Van Diemen's Land, Lord Howe Island, and Norfolk Island. During the 19th century, most of the colony's area was detached to form separate British colonies that eventually became New Zealand and the various states and territories of Australia. However, the Swan River colony was never administered as part of New South Wales. Lord Howe Island remains part of New South Wales, while Norfolk Island has become a federal territory, as have the areas now known as the Australian Capital Territory and the Jervis Bay Territory. The original inhabitants of New South Wales were the Aboriginal tribes who arrived in Australia about 40,000 to 60,000 years ago. Before European settlement, there were an estimated 250,000 Aboriginal people in the region. The Wodi people are the original custodians of the Illawarra region of South Sydney. Speaking a variant of the Dharawal language, the Wodi peoples lived across a large stretch of land which was roughly surrounded by what is now known as Campbelltown, Shoalhaven River and Moss Vale. The Bundjalung people are the original custodians of parts of the northern coastal areas. There are other Aboriginal peoples whose traditional lands are within what is now New South Wales, including the Wiradjuri, Gamilaraay, Yuin, Ngarigo, and Nagyampa peoples. In 1770, Lieutenant James Cook was the first European to visit New South Wales when he conducted a survey along the unmapped eastern coast of the Dutch-named continent of New Holland, now Australia. In his original journal covering the survey, in triplicate to satisfy Admiralty orders, Cook first named the land New Wales, after Wales. However, in the copy held by the Admiralty, he revised the wording to New South Wales. The first British settlement was made by what is known in Australian history as the First Fleet. This was led by Captain Arthur Phillip, who assumed the role of governor of the settlement on arrival in 1788 until 1792. After years of chaos and anarchy after the overthrow of Governor William Bligh, a new governor, Lieutenant Colonel Lachlan Macquarie, was sent from Britain to reform the settlement in 1809. During his time as governor, Macquarie commissioned the construction of roads, wharves, churches and public buildings, sent explorers out from Sydney and employed a planner to design the street layout of Sydney. Macquarie's legacy is still evident today. During the 19th century, large areas were successively separated to form the British colonies of Tasmania and Queensland. Responsible government was granted to the New South Wales colony in 1855. Following the Treaty of Waitangi, William Hobson declared British sovereignty over New Zealand in 1840. In 1841 it was separated from the colony of New South Wales to form the new colony of New Zealand. Charles Darwin visited Australia in January 1836 and in the Voyage of the Beagle records his hesitations about and fascination with New South Wales, including his speculations about the geological origin and formation of the Great Valleys, the Aboriginal population, the situation of the convicts, and the future prospects of the country. At the end of the 19th century, the movement toward federation between the Australian colonies gathered momentum. Conventions and forums involving colony leaders were held on a regular basis. Proponents of New South Wales as a free trade state were in dispute with the other leading colony, Victoria, which had a protectionist economy. At this time, customs posts were common on borders, even on the Murray River. Travelling from New South Wales to Victoria in those days was very difficult. Supporters of federation included the New South Wales Premier Sir Henry Parkes, whose 1889 Tenterfield speech was pivotal in gathering support for New South Wales involvement. Edmund Barton, later to become Australia's first Prime Minister, was another strong advocate for federation, and a meeting held in Corowa in 1893 drafted an initial constitution. In 1898, Popule